Hello, hello. This is Justin of SonicScoop, and I am here with the one and only Joel Hamilton, who is joining us from Bogota, Colombia. Joel, how are you doing?
I'm happy to be here in Bogota recording the new Oceans of Slumber record, and I'm happy for the Q&A. Let's get right into it.
All right, man. Excited to have you here. For those of you who missed it, Joel just did a full masterclass with us for MixCon. You've got to check it out if you haven't. It's with Mark Linkus of Sparkle Horse, great artist in kind of the indie folk, indie pop, alt country tradition. A lot of people in here recognized him, and one of the people wrote in to say he was bummed that his Sparkle Horse box set is now no longer complete because you're still making new records with Mark. And really great to hear this music and really great to hear your approach. Just a couple quick shout outs and thanks. Big thanks to the artist and his family for letting us go under the hood of this track. Really psyched to have this be part of MixCon. Also, big thanks to Joel and Studio G for doing this. And thanks to Plugin Alliance. The reason MixCon events are free to the public is because of our sponsors. And the sponsor on this one was Plugin Alliance. You'll have to check out, Joel did another video that's going to go on the Plugin Alliance channel where he does a whole stem mix just using their plugins. That'll be fun to check out. So look that up. And you guys also right now have an opportunity. You got 3 chances to win up to 10 grand in free gear. So look in the description and the comments down there to find your link to the MixCon Mega giveaway. All right, with all that out of the way, Joel, I want to talk to you and ask my own selfish questions first, and then we're going to have it really be driven by audience questions after that. But one thing that I notice here is, first of all, you've got a ton of hardware in the A room there in Studio G. And I don't think you always had a ton of hardware. Can you tell us over how long did that develop? And are you still buying hardware to this day, or does it you get to a point where it starts to finally slow down?
You do get to a point where it finally slows down a bit. We just celebrated the 30th anniversary of Studio G Brooklyn being a studio, 1993 to 2023. And so that collection represents, every time that I would do a record, because I didn't have a startup loan or a ton of money going into recording. It was more like do a record, get the rent paid, and hopefully have, 1,000 left over after that you can allocate to getting either a new mic or a new piece of gear. And over the years, that's exactly what happened. Each one of those boxes represents probably some record that I adore that's out there floating around somewhere. And it's kind of like almost a souvenir from making a record because they each were purchased on the heels of getting paid to do what I love to do. Um, it has slowed down only in the sense that my working method has kind of become codified a bit more. There's
Mm-hmm.
always variables, but at the same time, I definitely know the pieces that I can rely on. And so I definitely am experimenting less unless there's a new piece of equipment that just I think is really brilliant. There was like a Moog piece that came out that I got right away that I love. A few things that have come out in the last few years that I just adore. Um, but aside from that, we lean into the classics for a reason. They carry that sort of idiomatic, associative tone with them, and we've just been relying on them for so many years that I know what they're going to do for me in any given context, and that's more valuable, honestly, than what the piece of gear actually is. Just like monitors, if you know
Yeah.
them, you can mix on them.
100%. Yeah. I feel like at a certain point, there's a lot of creative freedom in having a set way of doing things. And that's not always what we think at first. We think we need to explore to have creative freedom. But to a certain point, once you understand your tool set, that's where sometimes the real creative freedom comes from. When you're not changing everything about the technology, but you're changing everything about your mindset and your approach, which is what we heard a lot about in this presentation.
It's
And
also a quick aside that has to do with that, and I'll make it fast, is that a lot of the recalls that I had to do back in the day would be from a 2-track machine that I would hit play at the same time as my 2-inch machine, just because that was, as close as I could get to recall it, because I hadn't done an entire recall sheet. So I'd have to do a recall by ear. And what was
mm,
so interesting to me again and again and again is that I could do the recall by ear without patching all the things that I had originally used, where I'd have some
hmm,
insane chain on the vocal, but they were used more as discovery tools than tools for executing any sort of tonal shaping. I just had to find it by messing with a million knobs in the room. And then once I found it, it was actually something that I could just cut a little 650 on the console
Yeah.
and add a little 12K and get right to essentially the exact same place, to the point where flipping back and forth felt enough like a recall with the verbs and delays that are on there or whatever. It felt enough like a recall that you were like, okay, now I'm patched to nothing, but I figured out the shape using all these outboard pieces of gear as discovery tools. And now I understand how that piece fits in the rest of the puzzle. I don't need a million jigsaws to do it. I can do it with one
Yes.
move.
That resonates so much with me because that's something I've literally seen happen while you were mixing in the room with you. I've had the privilege and pleasure of watching Joel mix a handful of times in my life. And I remember one of those times, I can't remember if it was Jolie Holland record or what it was, but you had a whole huge chain on the vocal. It was going through almost every single compressor in your whole studio. And you were talking about how, your shellac idea about how you really want to do layers and layers of varnish and not get everything out of one processor. But even with that said, later on, you were coming back and you were working on the same record, and then the same vocal had one or two compressors on it. So you're doing the varnish thing, but much less. And I was like, Joel, what's up? I thought you were doing this thing with all the compressors. And you kind of framed it as, no, I figured out what it needs to sound like now. And now I can get that without using so many tools. So sometimes the tools are there to help you find the rabbit, but you don't necessarily need them all to keep it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So a couple other things for you real quick is that a whole bunch, I want to shout out the sponsors here real quick and ask you a question, because I've noticed a whole bunch of the gear in your rack is slightly esoteric analog gear. You do have some of the standards, but some stuff that is like boutique and weird. And so many of them have been modeled by Plug-in Alliance. It's funny because I look at your actual analog rack and there's probably a whole bunch of Plug-in Alliance plugins you don't use because you have them as hardware. I notably see all of the Moog EQs and the Elysia compressor. Both of those are modeled. Can you tell us about a few of the tools that you've used? And I want to harp on a couple of those because those have been some of my favorites that I don't see everywhere, that I see in your room, that really stand out visually and I think have their own signature. Can you tell me about your Elysia compressor and tell me about your Moog EQs and why you like those?
The M-Presser I got when it was first debuted. Michael Brower and I literally had an actual foot race at AES to get over to the Elysia booth when he said, there's
Mm-hmm.
this thing you got to see. And I was like, I'm just going to get one, And of course, he got the first one because he's Brower, and I got the one right after him. And the thing is I called it the compressor from the future. And they actually put that quote on the PCB of the 500 series M-Presser and sent me serial number 001 of that one. So eventually I got a number one Elysia
Nice.
piece. Um, but the thing is that thing just works so well when you want to be able to manipulate. I mean, this sounds obvious, when you want to manipulate transients without a ton of artifacts. Like when I'm not looking for tonal shaping as a byproduct of compression, I'm just looking for actual envelope change. Um, it's so good at that, like super high headroom, just kind of making things move differently in a slow song, like this Sparkle Horse song, where you want it to feel like somebody's pushing their hips through molasses to get to you. It's like everything has to feel like it has a particular weight to it. Otherwise, everything feels a little too flicky, coming out of Pro Tools for a slow tempo song that doesn't have big heavy bass in it or something that can give the sense of inertia. So it's really that it's using things like the Moog Magnum K, the Moog EQs, the Elysia compressor. All of those are in service of giving things a sense of gravity. It's esoteric, and also the reason I have such esoteric gear is because I was freelance and I continue to be freelance to this day. And if I was working at Magic Shop or Avatar or wherever I was at any given moment, they all had an LA2A. They all had 1176s. They all had the quote normal stuff around. So I brought in racks that were always supplemental to the things you would normally expect to
Mm-hmm.
find in a professional recording studio. So I wound up with a studio full of the weird stuff.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense. Back when I was in New York and I was doing a lot of recording, that was the exact idea behind my mic collection. I had all of the weird Bear Dynamic mics that were, used
Yep.
in odd records that not everyone had. And it was, little secret weapon things that I felt like you wouldn't find in every studio to complement the kinds of normal New York studios you'd go to that all have their, uniform of
Yeah.
respectable studio gear. Yeah. So, one last quick question for you on the gear front before we get into the more important stuff and the audience questions. Is I have to gratuitously ask because plugin lines were so nice to make this thing happen. What would be, do you have a top three favorite plugin lines plugins that you might use most regularly?
Yeah, the Brainworks widener, the
Yeah.
SSL channel, and the Kirchhoff
Mhm.
for sure.
Sure. Cool stuff.
I love
And
those.
And then for those of you who don't have Joel's racks, probably at least the third of the pieces of gear in there, like the Mag EQs and like the Elysia Empress are in there. And the Elysia Empress plugin, if you ever want more than one of them, Joel, my goodness, to me it really sounds exactly how I remember the hardware one sounding. I haven't compared them back and forth, but the things like that gain reduction limit and that really interesting anti-log function that's on it, like all of those just sound exactly the way that I expected them to, having used the hardware impressors before. So check those out, guys. And now I'll get into your questions. And I don't want to harp too much on gear because two things that I take away whenever I listen to is one, Joel Hamilton has the best analogies, and that's what many of the comments in the live stream were about. So we always love that stuff. And two, there's a quote that you gave me ages ago that has always stuck with me, and I always liked that. When I see all the gear in your studio, I see it as they're the trappings of success rather than the things that caused your success. Like you've said yourself, you built that collection over time. Each one represents a record.
Mhm.
And I remember it was something you said to me early on, which was, Justin, there's nothing more depressing than going into a giant, beautiful studio, fully equipped, that looks like it's just waiting for Mariah Carey to walk in any day, and she never does. So that always stuck with me and like it was a haunting image.
Mhm.
So for those of you who don't have the same amount of crazy gear as Joel, just do stuff and get it over time if you really love the gear. So that would be the thing that I would add. All right.
The
Now
way
some
that developed,
questions for you from our audience.
it's
Skeleton Pete
important to
says,
say
great session.
the way
Every
that that
once in a
developed.
while, we need to be jogged out of our technical heads and reminded that the gear exists to facilitate artistic intentions, which really was a primary focus of what you talked about. Here's a question from another one of our members, Isomatic, who says, are there any books or activities Joel recommends to really hone into the feel and emotion of a song, to really internalize that sun shining on your skin feeling? Or can he just elaborate more? Pretty open-ended, but how do you get in touch with
Yes.
that? Go ahead.
Sorry, apologies. The latency from Colombia is massive that Justin and I are dealing with here. Um, we're not this awkward
Yes.
conversationally. Um,
Awkward, but not this bad.
so
Yes, go on.
so the yeah. So as far as books go, yeah, there's one called 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School that basically you can apply almost every single concept in that book, which is 100% about architecture. You can basically substitute music production, mixing, or engineering, audio engineering, for any of the times that they say when designing a building. You can say when mixing a record or producing whatever's appropriate. And it's incredible to me that there's references to asymmetrical balance in a composition. There's references in that book to the beauty of a thing being not just the sum of its parts, with examples like taping, Brad Pitt's lips to Pamela Anderson's eyes and, somebody else's nose or whatever, and see how, quote, beautiful that looks in a traditional sense. And yet we do those types of things all the time in the studio. When you sit around, I watch people sitting in solo mode listening to a kick drum until they make it into Brad Pitt's lips, and then it doesn't match up to Pamela Anderson's eyes and whoever else's nose, whatever like hot person of the day you want to reference. But so I hear so many mixes that have that kind of collaged sense and lack of unified beauty. And I think that this book is a great, it's well written, and even the graphics, there's sort of a graphic on the left of the page. It's kind of a coffee table book graphic on the left side of the page, and a singular thought on the right side of the spread each time. And it's a really beautifully laid out conceptual book about how to approach the art of presentation, or active, the activity when it comes to experiencing a creation of any kind. And in this case, again, it's architecture, but as far as how do you make a living room more active? How do people actually experience a room rather than just the square footage and the size, how many windows it has? And it's all very fast. You can open it almost like an oblique strategies deck, and just pick one page and look at one or two or three for the day, and let it set you on a path.
Yeah.
So that's the
So
book I
two
would recommend.
yeah. So two questions here. One, can you say the title again? There's 101 things to know about architecture.
101 Things I Learned in Architecture School.
101 things I learned in architecture school. And then Joel, because you and I are of a certain age, you say oblique strategies deck, and I immediately know what you're talking about. In case there are any youngins who are listening who don't know what that is, can you give them the quick 90-second elevator pitch for what that is?
It's Brian Eno created a deck of cards that just sort of has ideas and concepts in the same vein of what we're discussing, that I don't even have one, but I love the idea. I love the
Yeah.
intention of him making this, that it sort of breaks you out of something. And it's little quotes that say things like mute the vocal, or
Yeah.
turn up everything you think is bad about your production right now, turn down
hmm
everything you think is good, or just things that make you think differently. It's a way to try to bring perspective to a mix or a production situation.
Yeah. One of the ones that always stuck to me from it was, I believe, was something along the lines of honor error as if it is intent.
That's
You
great.
know,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
really like that one. All right. And I will piggyback on this question to ask about habits, in addition to things that you can read to kind of tap into this creative, making connection side. Are there habits you think that you have integrated into your life as daily practices or regular practices you think that are essential for you, helping you to stay creative and helping you stay in this mindset?
Yes, avoiding overstimulation,
Mm.
um,
hmm
in the sense of being able to keep the antennas up without it getting dull, like listening to the timbre of somebody's voice and understanding the metadata that it carries. Because we read each other so much, like, is this person who's singing or speaking to me, are they comfortable? Are they anxious? Are they, what's the feeling that I get from the sound they're making? Because we read each other in an audio sense so much. If we were walking
hmm
up the street, Justin and I, and neither of us speak Turkish, if we were walking up the street in Istanbul, we could hear up around the corner that it was most likely a wedding getting out and not a riot. Or we could
hmm
tell that it was just a pub where people are having fun. And we would make decisions based on just the sound of it, because we're not getting the literal information of the actual language being spoken. We're just hearing the timbre like it's a celebration rather than a dangerous situation. And we get that. And so a lot of things are just sort of thinking in those terms of where you can stay sensitive to those emotional cues in the timbre of anything, from the snare drum to an intimate vocal performance like Mark's.
Yeah. And that's very interesting coming from a New Yorker, because I feel like in New York, people are so overstimulated so much of the time just by the 8-9 million souls kind of pressing down on you and all the volume of everything, that there is sometimes this um, approach in New York where people need to put up their blinders and shut themselves off to the humanity of everyone around them, because otherwise it's too much. And finding ways to reconnect to that in that environment. And now we all find ourselves in an environment like a New York City dweller did for so many years, because now we're in these constant parties. Like there's a party at your fingertips at all times. And that crushing weight of humanity is always there. So being able to do exactly what you're talking about is probably more important than ever.
I think that's why I'm protective of that ability for us to tune into that connection rather than just a blur of Instagram, TikTok, and people. There's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with it. It just becomes a blur rather than the individual gestures really feeling meaningful.
Right. I hear you. All right, let's go with some more audience questions. We've got Joel's literally in the middle of a session right now in Bogota, so we have limited time. So I want to get through more of your questions. Here's another one from Zach Orr that says, in the masterclass, Joel has a mult on the vocal with the SansAmp plugin on it. He said he mixed that in for urgency. Could he talk about that process, like when he would bring that mult in or out?
It was a sort of multi-timbral thing the whole time. I didn't ever automate in or out. It just was a way to give the vocal timbre a sort of leading edge, because Mark sings so quietly that to try to mine some punch, you either have to compress the heck out of it or give some sort of drive. But it wasn't a song where you wanted a driven vocal, but having the drive in parallel, that's why it was multed. Having the drive in parallel allowed me to just sort of park that fader right where it felt like the voice creeps up on you a bit more in headphones or moves to the front of the speakers, but without sounding driven per se.
Hmm.
So that's what I meant by urgency, that it sort of was like if your friend gets excited when they're telling you something on the phone, the way it engages with that little microphone. And it's not blown out like you can't understand what they're saying, but it feels a bit punchier, like, hey, you got to listen to this. And it feels close to the microphone and like it's hitting the diaphragm a bit harder in the first place. And because we can't re-sing it, it was definitely something where I was looking for a just a little more sort of smackiness to the leading edge of all those statements. It's like when you're trying to tell a sibling to shut up without your parents hearing you, like across the table. So
Hmm.
there's this quiet intensity in your face of being like, "Grr," but without yelling, because you can't just scream over the dinner table, but you're telling them to be quiet. Like don't talk about that when I snuck out last week or whatever. It's that pressure in the chest or in the throat that happens for a quiet intensity rather than just cranking it up, because obviously I could just turn it up really loud and it would sound urgent.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And to piggyback on that for a second, something that someone else mentioned when the masterclass was happening was they were amazed at how confident you were in pushing the vocal as loud as you did. And I think that comes from having real confidence of vision, which is something that you talked about. Like the vocal is very prominent and very stable and very articulate in the mix. And do you have how do you come to that sense of what should be the most important at any given time? Because you do talk a little bit about subtracting things and making the speakers not do too much so they can focus on what really needs to be heard at that moment, which is an idea that really resonates with me and I try to get through to a lot of my mix coaching students. So how do you determine what should be the most central element that you shouldn't be afraid to push and make featured?
Well, for me, there's always a visual component to creating a narrative arc, sort of imagining what's the size of the things in the room other than the vocal in this case. And when the drums here, what's serving as drums in this could be some little desktop dusty looking box with a push button on it. It's not like somebody with tattoos hitting the drums really hard over the shoulder
Right.
of the singer in this case. It's some little cuckoo clock wind up thing on a dusty old grandma's desk type of sound. And so in this case, the shot would be much more about having this, the foreground, be Mark's face. I mean, really, and then there's all these sort of little wind up toys behind him that never feel like they're trying to take over the shot. They give it
Yeah.
they give the story context, but they're not ever really going to be the leading man here. Because Mark's a guy, that's why I gendered it.
Yes. 100%. And yeah, I've come more and more to this idea that I've noticed again and again in great sounding productions is that there's almost always this order of priority where I can identify, if I really think about it, one or two primary instruments in any great mix at any one moment. There's one or two primary elements, one or two supporting elements, and then there's the everything else. And
Yeah.
being able to visualize where things are as far as like depth goes, which is something you focus on here, what's behind what, what's in front of what, really helps make that come together. So I think that's something I can't just highlight enough. I think you have a really great insight and a great way of describing it. Let's
Well,
go on to some more
imagine two
questions.
people. Imagine two people hugging in the middle of Times Square, and all the extras are like constantly walking right in front of the camera. While
Mm,
I mean, that you can use that
yeah.
for effect, like deliberately obscured, and yet
Yes.
otherwise, it's like the extras are definitely instructed not to stand right in front of the camera
Right.
if the star is 5 feet back from it. And so, I mean, there's a reason for that, and it's because they're central to the narrative being expressed. It's not just because one person's cuter than the other.
Yeah.
If there's a central character here, then everybody else is just giving context. They're in a crowd, and what we're working with manipulating here is representational. It's not
Yeah.
actual. So I don't care how big it was actually in the room. It's just
Yeah.
that in the representational world that we're working in, Mark is in the foreground and everything
Totally.
else is supporting that and giving it context.
Yeah, and visualizing it as in the film context, if you were going to have things or people obstruct the main characters in your film, an intelligent filmmaker who's doing a film with a budget would only do that because it's communicating something emotional where we want there to be uncertainty. We want there to be, it's hard to grasp exactly what's going on. We're trying to make the scene more chaotic. And if that's not your intent, like you have to know what the intent of the scene is. And the intent of the scene is we're having an emotional moment with those two. We don't want to distract from it. If we're trying to frustrate an emotional experience, then maybe we'd do it. It goes back to your idea of intent. And I think these visual analogies are perfect for that.
When the presentation of a concept follows the narrative, we always experience it as correct.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Always.
Yeah. Yep. I like that a lot, Joel. All right, let's get through some more questions because I know you have limited time here. Sarah T says, Joel mentioned putting the Fairchild 660 on an aux for the nylon string guitars. Are there other plugins or tools that you would tend towards using when dealing with nylon string guitars?
Yes, it's usually gain based because they're such quiet instruments. And depending on the player, if it's just sort of like an electric guitarist that picks up a nylon to do an overdub, there's usually compression involved to get the sort of response, the overall chord to flatten out so that we don't have this like root dominant craziness going on, or, just to get the balance of the instrument correct. Not just the dynamics of the performance, but just the balance overall of the chords.
Mm-hmm.
In general, it's finding static EQ cuts to make the nylon sound humble. In this case, if we talk about it specifically, it can sound like a bunch of rubber bands on a cigar box sometimes, or you try to get some of the finger pluck out of it with high end. In general, I feel like it's one of those things that in my world, it's usually a supporting element, and therefore it can be kind of messed with a lot. It's not a purist approach ever. It's like, I'm going to shape this to fit in the puzzle of everything else, much more than thinking that the way it sounded out in the live room should have any bearing on the way I'm going to present it in the mix.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it also harks back to that idea you're talking about getting the right fit and not picking the lips from someone else and putting them on someone else. Because one of the reasons that the vocals sound so big is that you are keeping things like the nylon string guitar, like the drums, allowing them to sound small and humble is one of the things that gives us that impression of size in the vocal. You can't have everything be big at once. So another one here, this is a little bit more gear specific. This is Mark K, who asks, how do you decide when to use a plugin instead of outboard gear and vice versa? Is it for the difference in tone?
Interesting. It's not for the difference in tone. Plugins have gotten so good in general that I've found that the variation between something like a 670 or an LA2A, there's more variation that I've found from one unit that has a cloudy repair history and another one that lived in a big studio and was taken care of for 60 years very well might sound more different than the good one and the plug-in. It's like the variation from unit to unit is in
Yeah.
vintage gear is insane. Like 47s all sound different. So whether it's a reissue or an old one, 10 old ones all sound different. And so gear specific wise, the choices are usually based more on functionality. Do I want to slow this down before it hits a console? Because remember that what I'm doing, any of the in the box processing, ultimately does hit a bunch of analog stages after coming out of the box into an analog console. So there's times where I want the EQ that I'm using in the analog domain to not have to deal with the peaks that something's delivering if it's a very smacky performance or something with a lot of leading edge on it, like a very, thwacky steel string guitar. I might compress that in the box just so that it comes into the line amp in a way that I can use more EQ. Again, it's not for purist anything. I can, wind on the low end and never have it crap out because it's coming out of the box like it was recorded that way. It's almost like being able to re-record it in my brain, like supply myself with the track I want to see arrive at the console and then balance that on analog faders. So it's
Beautiful.
like
That makes a
gain
lot of
staging
sense.
essentially.
Yep, definitely. All right, let's see a couple more here. Ricardo asks, my question to Joel is, now that it isn't the norm to learn or study under a professional like yourself, if you were starting now, what do you think you'd do to be or have the same success that you do now? And I'll add to that question where, Joel, I don't know if you had a traditional I'm the assistant at a huge studio background yourself. So answer that question however you like. I just wanted to add that for context.
I would do exactly what I did, which is try things on my own and come up with things that wound up being specific to me. There's times where I thought I invented something and I'm like hacking my way through the pricker bushes using horribly broken things and whatever I could afford at the time. And then I come out into a clearing and there's Brian Eno sitting there with like a snifter, like, I see you figured this out. Or I find Rupert Neve sitting there saying, I see you figured out that 820 is a great thing to cut out of everything, and
Mhm.
you realize later when you're working on some EQ that 820 is built into some EQs and it was chosen for a reason. It's like I felt very vindicated that I sort of arrived in the same place as other people in history with that had had a lot of success, um, but kind of on my own path, or what I saw as my own path. Maybe it was because you could imagine it being blindfolded, but on a path other people had been on, or you can imagine it being your own path. But either way, it was definitely about experimentation without guilt. Using the entire little studio I had built as a discovery tool is so important. That's why I keep coming back to this discovery tool concept, where it's like the EQ, when you're messing with it, it's a tool for discovery until it's a tool for execution. Just like if you're messing around on a piano, you can't make a mistake until you start repeating a form and writing a song, and then you'll know when you make a mistake because the intention, your finger slipped off of the intended key. But in the beginning, it's funny that we give ourselves this sort of psychic space to just kind of hammer away at an instrument to figure it out. And yet when we step up to a piece of gear, it's like you're expected to know exactly, okay, it's going to be 622 that I'm going to notch down zero point 0.5, like sweep it around, go nuts if you don't hear the frequencies that way yet, which eventually you will, but that's a muscle that you work on to where you then get in the range where you're like, I hear what's quote wrong with this, or what I'd like to change is something in the 700 to 1K zone is not quite right. And then as you work more and more and more and more, you probably get tighter as to identifying the frequencies you'd like to notch out or whatever. But in the beginning, do big things that feel big and dumb. Just make a
Mhm.
giant, like, spiky boost in the kick drum with your speakers low so you don't blow them up, and crank it at 12K and see how it affects your mix. It's probably not what the new AI based mastering plugin would do. And that's exactly why you should do it, because we're not all looking to reside in the center of the Venn diagram. We don't need an algorithmic averaging of all the techniques that have ever come before us. We need people to step outside those techniques and push that circle. That's where the art lives for me. Anyway, I could go on about that for 10 hours, but I'll stop there.
Absolutely beautiful. Yeah, I think that's a great nugget there, Joel. And just so people understand a little bit better your own background, the first studios you were ever in working on music in, what were they like? Because you didn't have an SSL console and a Neve console down the
No,
hall from you when you first started. So what kinds of studio environments were you beginning your craft in?
a cassette 4 track in my parents' basement. And then once I finally got to work in a more professional setting, I thought it was insane that there was a console at all, and like a 16-track Tascam recorder and a couple of decent mics. And the first studio I ever had was I got a 16-track 2-inch machine, which at the time was just like a broken anything we could afford. It was an old MCI, because Pro Tools didn't exist. It wasn't like a cool, we're trying to use tape and be analog. This was just before digital was readily available. And a little console, and that's what I worked on. And we would move the record cards around, and all these old stories that sound like a grandpa that I walked in the snow for 100 miles or whatever. But it's like I had one compressor, and it was a DBX 160X. And then I figured out that if I put a delay unit in the side chain, all of a sudden I could affect it like it was an attack time because it didn't have
Mm.
attack and release. And so I'd put it on room mics by delaying the detector. And
Wow.
so like experimenting with that was completely bizarre, because if you put it really long, you'd wind up being able to find an eighth note where it's like a ducker that sounds like a side chain, because the snare would hit, and then an eighth note later you'd see the compressor react wildly. And it's like if you brought it in really close, like 20 milliseconds, all of a sudden you'd have some leading edge on that snare drum again. But the fact that I could go really stupid all the way out to like, 1200 milliseconds or something on the Effectron I was using, that meant that I found techniques that I would use later in a creative way, but out of necessity in the beginning. So again, even if you have a delay pedal, just loop it out of whatever you're using in the box and mess with it. Run it into just an input and to the side chain of a compressor, just something that seems dumb to you in the moment, but force yourself to make that work. And there's so much information in forcing yourself to make a dumb idea work in the context of a rock song or a singer songwriter or whatever. It's amazing what you find at the edges of normal.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And I can't believe it. I've been in audio for, more than 2 decades now, and I never thought about the idea of using a delay as an attack time on a compressor that doesn't have an attack. So I've just been humble for never making that connection. Um, and I'll just, we got to let Joel go now because he has to get back to his session. So I'm going to ask one final question, the best question that's in here, whatever that might be. But on the assistant tip, it's like, there are so many people who become assistants, who become lifelong assistants. So even back then, it wasn't the only path. And I don't know if, Brower or whoever else would even people who were assistants, whether that was the big thing that drove their careers forward. So I think you can do it. This one piggybacks on that same question. So this will be the last one, Joel, because I know we got to let you go. And I'm going to pick out this one because I think it's similar. It was Rebecca who is asking, I just lost it. Can an engineer successfully mix without any analog gear using just plugins? This is coming from someone who uses a lot of analog gear, but what are your thoughts on it? And if you were starting today, would you have as much analog gear as you do now?
The answer is really a person can quote successfully mix a record with no gear
Hmm.
whatsoever. If it's already been tracked and you have a DAW, I mean, they all come with some plugins, but even that's kind of irrelevant. Like if you're willing to automate everything, if you're you can come up with a really compelling presentation of a set of tracks without any plugins, without anything. And it's not some like ninja level Mr. Miyagi thing. It's just the fact that if you have a vision for what is the foreground, what's the midfield, and what's in the background, it's amazing how faders go a really long way in the presentation. It's a finite system that we work within anyway. No matter how much gear you have, there's always going to be some finite amount of headroom at the mix bus. So nobody who's ever mixed a record had infinite headroom, infinite time, infinite gear. So what we do is we prioritize, right? It's a pie chart. It doesn't get any bigger. And if you spend 90% of the time worrying about what plugin is the best one for the backing vocals, then you've got 10% of the time allocated to you to actually make the whole song sound good and be compelling to the listener. And most likely that would be a poor use of that time and resources that are given to you. So for me, I would wind up working at the faders first because when you say, I want the vocal to be out front, and once in a while, I want this clean tone guitar to challenge the dominance of that vocal so it sounds exciting, like the voice is fighting to be heard. All of a sudden, it sort of fills in the gap. Why would I use a compressor at all? Maybe to hold that same sort of timbre, but a slightly lower volume that's never allowed to flick in front of the face that's delivering the story vocally. It's like you change the envelope and you change the particular sound of it, and you wind up with a fundamental feeling of why you would even need those pieces of equipment in the wall or in your list of plugins or anywhere, wherever it physically lives. You start to understand why they exist rather than thinking they do it for you. That the plugin gives you a way to mix is upside down from what's actually happening. You're mixing, that's like saying that the drill makes the birdhouse, or that the wood makes the drill turn. It's like it's backwards. The What you're working on is a piece of wood, and then all of a sudden you realize you need a perfectly round hole, and guess what? A drill's a really good way to make a perfectly round hole in the wood.
Hmm.
But it starts with your vision of saying, I need a perfectly round hole. And otherwise it never becomes a beautiful little birdhouse without that vision. So if it leads with you prioritizing within whatever system you have to work on, we would read that intention like, okay, this vocally driven exciting song, and then you would start to choose devices that help that story along in ways that maybe aren't easily achievable just with faders due to masking and physics and the way it works with the rest of the system. So you use all the rest of these plugins or pieces of gear just to kind of trick people into hearing it like you had infinite headroom at the mix bus, because none of us did. But it's like, wow, how is the kick that big and the bass is happening at the same time, and I can hear the vocal perfectly clearly? And it's because you figured out what thing drilled a perfectly round hole in the birdhouse.
I love it, Joel. There's another 3 or 4 questions in here that I can ask that would all be great, but I want to be respectful of your time. I know that you have
Let's
clients
do
here.
one
We should
more.
probably one more. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Oh man, I don't know how to top that. Yeah, you're having such a good place here. Here's a question that Dee Dee asks, and I'm sorry to pass over you, Rebecca and Mark and Alexander and a couple of you, but Dee Dee says, would you change the arrangement the composer delivered if you think it's necessary from your perspective? Did you like the flamming percussion in this song you were working on? It sounded a bit, quote unquote, wrong for me sometimes. So, what are the times where you feel like this is a suggestion? You can start making suggestions that are arrangement based, where that's appropriate, if ever, in your work as a mixer.
If I am the producer, it's appropriate. If I'm the mixer, it's not. I have to figure out what presentation is the most flattering to the content that the band and the producer have delivered to me. And I will say this as a quick answer to this one. In the absence of artistic vision, we're usually left with perfection as the goal. and
Mm,
and and that drives me nuts. It's the idea that the flamming being a detriment, if it's distracting. I understand that, but it also, to me, the fact that you referenced it at all is an asset to the production. And I would
mm,
actually look into it harder if I had some research focus group and 90% of the people said they heard the flamming and wanted to know about whether that was okay or not. I'd be like,
yeah.
that's exactly why that's there. 100%.
Mm. Yep, I like that. I remember the very first time or two I listened to New Order, some classic tracks like Blue Monday or something. The first time I ever heard them, I was like, "Ooh, I'd probably do another vocal take there." And then
Mhm.
after you hear the songs a few times, like, no, 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 the personality of the record is there because we're hearing someone's actual personality. We're not hearing a
Completely.
repaired version of their personality, and I think those records stick with people because we're hearing human expression, which does not exist without the warts and imperfections.
I mean, or let's just frame it as we're hearing perfection because it engages the listener in the way that it was originally intended to,
Mm.
with the narrative completely intact. Whereas if I have a ruler and I draw a line with that ruler, that says I have a ruler. If I draw a line without the ruler, that's every time I ever fell off my bicycle as a kid. That's every time I've ever cried. That's everything I've ever done in my life in that line. And it's amazing to me that the value of the ruler somehow winds up being an easy escape from revealing ourselves to the person that I'm drawing my freehand line to. It's such an easy way to just like take a ruler and draw a straight line. So you're an artist now because you have a ruler. I just don't believe that. And I don't believe it's a more compelling story than someone's entire life that led up to them making a mark on a piece of paper with a pencil. I'd much
Mm.
rather hear that story than I went to Staples and bought a plastic ruler for $1.99.
Right,
Somehow that's
right.
not compelling to me.
Fair enough. Okay, last one because I'm going to have to cut it off here because I know you have clients in there with you.
I do.
But this is one that's a little bit loaded. This is Ari Garcia says, do you think that analog consoles, which you use in your studio, do you think that they will have a place in the studio a few years from now?
I think that there is a particular way of working that comes with having everything laid out in front of me that resonates with my creative process the same way that I could draw musical notes and create a triad with piano samples, or I can take 3 fingers and play a triad on a piano. And the 3 fingers down on the piano has a particular expression built into it that I find valuable in what we do in the music business. So I would much, much rather have a way to physically interact with the tracks, whether it's a control surface. I really don't care about the analog aspect of it as much as I care about the physicality of being able to interact with it. Just like a control surface with a great piano sound module can be amazing. I don't care that it's not a Steinway grand. I just care that the person who's playing is able to have a physical connection in real time with what they're creating. And that, I think that's always going to be important, because it's not about the analog digital blah 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 blah. It's about a physical connection to the way we create music is something that feels valuable to me in instrumentation and in music production on both sides of the glass.
Yeah. And to your point, I think a lot of the other big mixers who have moved to digital, say Mick Gazowski or Michael Brower, they use control services.
Yeah.
Brower has a relatively small setup, but Gazowski has an S6 console. And I think that they're getting the same thing out of those, many of the same things out of those that you get out of your SSL in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, Joel, absolutely wonderful. I've got to put you again and again in my top few favorite people to interview. I feel like I've interviewed you several times, and each time I feel like I could do it 50 more times, and I wouldn't exhaust everything that you have to say about this stuff. It's really a pleasure and an honor to bring you on the channel and share your take with folks. Thank you guys for joining us. If you haven't checked out, if people aren't familiar with you, they want to follow you, find out more about you, what are the best places to keep up with what you're doing?
Wow. I don't know. Instagram.
All right. That's the general answer. Is there Studio G Instagram they should follow, or a Joel Hamilton Instagram they should follow? What's
Joel
more active
Hamilton.
there?
Joel
Okay.
Hamilton.
All right. I think it's, yep. All right. So check them out there. Big thanks again to Plugin Alliance for making this one free to the public. Check out anything they make for free over at pluginalliance.com. If you want Joel's console inside your DAW, they have that console G. A whole bunch of the gear he has in his rack there is modeled by Plugin Alliance. So check those guys out. Big thanks to them. Big thanks again to the artist Sparkle Horse. Definitely check out this record. It's coming out in Anti Records. It's a super fresh one from a artist who has an amazing legacy. So big thanks to Mark Linkous' family for letting us use this track and go under the hood. Big thanks again to Joel and to his clients for letting him escape his session just so he could answer all your questions.
Yes, thank you. Special thanks to Oceans of Slumber for letting me take 45 minutes out of the session and actually do it. So
thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right. Go check out Oceans of Slumber. Type them into the Google machine. So give them their due. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Coletti of SonicScoop with Joel Hamilton. See you next time.